Jack Smith marches forward with his January 6th inquiry into Donald Trump. We're waiting for an indictment any day now. And there's questions about who his key witnesses are. Who is going to be joining the government's prosecution, either directly as a star witness who's going to voluntarily show up, or as a reluctant witness, somebody who just is like, well, I have to go through the motions here and I'm going to be honest. But secretly, they would also like to have that person taken out because it would clear the path for them in their pursuit of the presidency. Who could we be talking about? Mike Pence, of course, this fellow right here. Big questions now about whether he has given Jack Smith, the special counsel, exactly what he wants. We've got other questions about guys like Mark Meadows and whether the DOJ has put pressure on these people to cause them to flip. Now, in this segment, we're going to talk about this concept of recklessness, and it ties to a very key legal element called a mens rea, a mental state. And when we hear this word reckless, a lot of defense attorneys out there are going to be screaming bingo, because that's exactly the phrase that is going to fill the gap of a missing mens rea that's going to enable the prosecution of Trump. Let's see what Mike Pence said before we jump into the actual analysis from the Department of Justice and their manual. Here was what Mike Pence said on CNN.
Joining me now is GOP candidate and former Vice President Mike Pence. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I want to start by asking about...
Thank you, Dana. Good to be on.
Thank you. About your former boss. He is facing a potential third indictment over his efforts to overturn the 2020 election.
Coming.
You said, you quote, hope it doesn't come to that, and the American people should decide his future at the ballot box. But I just want to be clear. If the Justice Department has evidence that he committed a crime related to January 6th, you do not think he should be charged?
All right, Mike, you're up.
Well, look, I know I did my duty that day under the Constitution. And frankly, as we traveled across New Hampshire this week, 10 events in communities across the state, I was deeply moved at how many people expressed their appreciation to me for the stand that we took for the Constitution. Yeah, and I've said many times.
We've heard this, many times.
The president's words were reckless that day. I had no right to overturn the election.
Bingo!
While his words were reckless,
Bingo!
Based on what I know, I'm not yet convinced that they were criminal. I obviously wasn't there for every meeting. I was busy trying to help reopen the government and country after the COVID pandemic. I was spending a fair amount of time in Georgia, Dana, as you remember, in those special elections.
Don't know what Trump was doing.
But from what I know, I really do hope it doesn't come to that, and also for the reason that I do.
I'm sure you hope it doesn't come to that. Now, we're going to come back to Mike Pence. Let's put a pause on that. But you heard the word reckless twice, and then you heard Mike Pence say, but I don't really know. I don't really know what he did or what was happening here. But let's go over to the Justice Department manual and see what they say about the word reckless. Now, this you'll see is from the DOJ website, and they've got a manual called the Criminal Resource Manual, where there's all sorts of rules and regulations, and their prosecutors go here, defense attorneys go here, everybody looks it up. They say, how do you handle this type of case? Or how do you handle this type of case? And so on. Now, you see here that different provisions of the U.S. Code, in particular the conspiracy section, we ask ourselves about what's called a mens rea, a mental state. So in most criminal cases, you have two components that are necessary in order to bring criminal charges. You've got to have a statute that's violated. Within that statute, it's got all the different elements of the law. And typically you'll see stuff in there that says you can't, make physical contact with somebody that causes injury, right? That's the physical thing that happened. That's the action. But that's only one part. You've also got to have the mental state, the mindset. What was going on in the person's mind? Did they intentionally swing to take that action? Or was this an accident? Did the person not swing at all? Did they knowingly do it? Were they acting recklessly? And then you combine those two, a guilty mind plus an illegal action. 1 + 1 = 2, mens rea plus actus reus equals a criminal charge. So in the Trump saga, we've been asking ourselves, wait a minute, is there evidence here that Donald Trump was acting knowingly and willfully insurrecting America? Are you kidding me right now? You're telling me that Donald Trump was knowingly conspiring to steal an election? Now, I know that a lot of people on MSNBC think that, but we got to see that in evidence. I know they wake up every day frothing all over the place, hyperventilating about it, but we need to see some evidence, and they've got to prove this. So is it knowingly? Did Trump knowingly act, or did he willfully act? Let's take a look. They say, as used in the statute, the term knowingly, so did Donald Trump knowingly insurrect? Did he know the election was lawful? It says it requires only that the defendant acted with knowledge of the falsity. So if they're saying the election was legal, Trump is saying it's not legal. He knew that that was false, therefore it was a knowing wrong mental state. So we say that's kind of a hard thing to get to. Did he know it? I don't think we've seen any evidence of that. Now, we haven't seen the indictment yet, but we'll see. Now, willfully is another term. Means no more than the forbidden act was done deliberately and with knowledge, and it doesn't require proof of evil intent. An act is done willfully if it's done voluntarily and intentionally, that is doing something that the law forbids. And again, this is the other component of this. Does the law forbid what Donald Trump did? I mean, they tightened up the Electoral Count Act. They've modified some of the procedures, and we've got some precedent that I think you can make the argument in prior elections when there are contested votes that things go back. There are other different things that happen. Not every election runs exactly how they wanted it to this time. Doesn't mean it was illegal. You see both of those terms, willful and knowingly, but we still haven't seen reckless yet, except right here. Tucked away within the subsection of knowingly is this recklessness. Proof, so insert Donald Trump here. Proof that Donald Trump acted with reckless disregard or reckless indifference may satisfy the knowledge requirement, okay? So in other words, the government is not going to need to prove, I think that they're going to make an argument like this, that Trump had the specific intent to overthrow the country, because that's going to be a hard thing to prove. Trump says, I know I lost, steal it anyways, go. Bring the helicopter, and Clavicle Girl is stopping Trump from seizing the Secret Service vehicle, right? All of that. But they're not going to be able to get that evidence. So the language that we're going to see differently, and this is going to be a big pivot shift. I mean, we're already starting to see this bubble up, but this is where it's going. It's about reckless disregard, or look at this, reckless indifference. It may satisfy the knowledge requirement. So this is the Liz Cheney conversation. Oh, Donald Trump was just sitting in the Oval Office. He was eating Cheerios and watching the daily news, whatever. And you go, what did you want him to do? Like parachute into the Capitol building or something? Weirdos. He doesn't have to go out there and do cartwheels like Liz Cheney mandates, because it is his office, not hers. That's executive discretion. But what they're going to do is they're going to say, when the defendant makes a false material statement and consciously avoids learning the facts or intends to deceive the government, that constitutes recklessness, and the recklessness is going to constitute knowingly, and that's going to be the guilty mind, all right? And the question is, who is helping with that narrative? And Mike Pence, you just heard him say the word reckless twice. Donald Trump was reckless. He wasn't knowingly insurrecting, but by disregarding all of the other, experts telling him everywhere, that amounts to recklessness, and he was doing it to avoid learning the facts. He didn't want to accept reality. And this is where this is going, my friends. And so this is Mike Pence, and I think they're bringing up the different pawns on the chessboard to line them up. That's why we're starting to see this narrative shift. So let's go back to Mike Pence. We'll hear him say it one more time, and we'll play through the interview.
10 events in communities across the state. I was deeply moved at how many people expressed their appreciation to me for the stand that we took for the Constitution. And I've said many times that the president's words were reckless that day. I had no right to overturn the election. But while his words were reckless, based on what I know, I'm not yet convinced that they were criminal. I obviously wasn't there for every meeting. I was busy trying to help reopen the government and the country after the COVID pandemic. I was spending a fair amount of time in Georgia, Dana, as you remember, in those special elections. But, from what I know, I really do hope it doesn't come to that. And also for the reason that I do think the Department of Justice has lost the confidence of the American people. I mean, in one town hall after another across New Hampshire, I heard a deep concern for a perception about the unequal treatment of the law. I think one more indictment against the former president will only contribute to that sense among the American people. And as I said, I'd rather that these issues and the judgment about his conduct on January 6th be left to the American people in the upcoming primaries, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, we know that's not going to happen. We expect an indictment this week, any minute now, actually. And we know Mike Pence and others testified in the grand jury proceeding because special counsel shattered the privilege that existed previously. So Mike Pence, as Donald Trump's vice president, was previously shielded by executive privilege. He was not allowed to testify against Donald Trump until they shattered that privilege in the D.C. courts. Now we've got questions about what they extracted out of the D.C. courts in order to use in the indictment in Florida, and whether a Florida judge would have allowed those same investigatory tactics to have been done in Florida? Answer, probably no. And so an indictment's coming up any minute now, and we don't really know what Mike Pence said, or what Mark Meadows said, or what Trump's lawyer, who also had his privilege breached, Evan Corcoran, said.
Well, part of the reason why people believe that the Justice Department is not being fair is because your former boss is telling them that's the case. I just want to...
Yeah, in addition to the long record of their abuses, they're the ones who did Crossfire Hurricane. They're the ones who lied to us after January 6th, after many different ordeals, including the documents and the 51 so-called intelligence experts with the laptop. There has been dishonesty from all of the people in charge for a long time. Now we've got these whistleblowers who are blowing the whistle on the DOJ, IRS. Merrick Garland's lying to us. His story contradicts David Weiss. The list goes on and on and on. It's not just Donald Trump who is putting a couple truths out that's causing this backlash. It's all of America and the world seeing it. And now they're prosecuting their political enemy openly in front of all of the world to see. No wonder there's backlash.
To follow up and to say, you're right. I remember you were traveling a lot and you weren't in every meeting that he had. This is what the special counsel has been doing, gathering evidence. If that evidence does point to an actual crime, you still think that it's better for the country that he not be indicted and held accountable?
According to who? A crime according to the DOJ, the same DOJ that has been corrupted throughout this entire ordeal. And we've seen them make up stories and provide cover for Joe Biden at the expense of Donald Trump. Yeah, we don't trust their indictment. Yeah, their indictment is going to cause more of a fissure. They should let the people vote, but they know that that's not going to be good enough for them. In order to maintain power, they've got to eliminate the choice from the people, which has been their pattern for a long time. Whether it's on social media, you can't comment about the pandemic. You can't comment about election problems or about certain pharmaceutical drugs. You can't speak. And during the pandemic, you can't leave your home. And so now they don't want you to be able to vote for your president. They want him removed off ballots, urging secretaries of state at Nevada and other places to just take him off because he's an insurrectionist now. So no, Dana, no.
Well, look, it's not just what the former president has said about his situation. I mean, look, we had whistleblower testimony on Capitol Hill this week that, in all fairness, was largely ignored by much of the national media.
Well, no, we did that, but I just want to ask about
IRS agents that were talking about obstructions of investigations into the president's family, and then we learned about one instance after another of FBI officials saying that they were obstructed from asking questions. I'll be honest with you, as I traveled around New Hampshire, I heard again and again from people about a deep concern about unequal treatment of the law, and it's why I said to people, if I'm elected president of the United States, we're not just going to have a new attorney general, we're going to clean house among all the senior leadership at the Justice Department, and we're going to appoint men and women of integrity who will have the confidence of Americans across the political spectrum for their commitment to the rule of law.
Sir, I hear what you're saying about that, and I'm sure you are hearing that on the campaign trail, but
Tell
because
me why you
you have a very unique perspective because your life and the life of your family was at risk that day, which you have talked about very extensively. You still believe that the former president should be held to a different standard if what you experienced turned out to be based in breaking the law, and that is shown through evidence found by the special.
He should be held to the same standard that Hillary Clinton got held to and that Joe Biden is currently being held to, but he's not.
Counsel's investigation?
Well, Dana, let me be very clear. President Trump was wrong on that day, and he's still wrong in asserting that I had the right to overturn the election. But what his intentions were, and as you know, criminal charges have everything to do with intent.
But you just said it was reckless.
State of mind was, and I don't honestly know what his intention was that day. Whether as he spoke to that crowd, as he tweeted during the riot itself. But for my part, from what I saw, as I've said, his actions were reckless. I believe that history will hold him accountable. I believe that Republican primary voters know that we need new leadership in this party. I know that some of the pundits and the pollsters think it's different out there, but I got to tell you, based on the enthusiasm and the support that we're seeing not only across New Hampshire this week, but Iowa and states around the country, I'm absolutely convinced that we're going to have a new standard bearer in this party, and we're going to work every day to make sure it's us.
I just have one last question about this because this is so personal to you. And when I say this, I'm talking about the potential for violence. Donald Trump said this week, talked about how his supporters might react if he is charged and faces potential jail time.
I think it's a very dangerous thing to even talk about because we do have a tremendously passionate group of voters, much more passion than they had in 2020 and much more passion than they had in 2016. I think it would be very dangerous.
Does that kind of rhetoric worry you?
What did he say?
Well, it doesn't worry me because I have more confidence in the American people and in the people in our movement.
He didn't say anything also.
Look, it was one of the things that infuriated me on January 6th with what I saw, people ransacking the Capitol and engaging in violence against law enforcement officers down. I would say not just the majority, but virtually everyone in our movement are the kind of Americans who love this country, are patriotic, who are law and order people, who would never have done anything like that there or anywhere else. So I have more confidence in the American people than that. I hear my former running mate's frustration in his voice, but I'm sure the American people will respond in our movement in a way that will express, as they have every right to, under the First Amendment, to express concerns that they have about what they perceive to be unequal treatment of the law. But I'm not concerned about it beyond that.
That's pretty remarkable that you're not concerned about it, given the fact that they wanted to hang you on January 6th. I want to move on to the issues that you were talking about.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. I want to say to you, there's been an effort to take those that perpetrated violence on January 6th and use a broad brush to describe everyone in our movement.
No, I didn't mean to do that. I'm just here to
tell you, it's not the case. The people in this movement, the people who rallied behind our cause in 2016 and 2020 are the most God-fearing, law-abiding, patriotic people in this country. And I won't stand for those kind of generalizations because they have no basis in fact.
Yeah, and what I meant was that it has the potential to incite those who were incited on January 6th.
Okay, so she walked that back. What an interesting clip there. All right, there's a lot to unpack there. Now, Mike Pence is doing the tap dance, man. He is just tiptoeing around all of these issues, just pop, 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 firing off all over the place. And he's trying to thread the line between Trump is very bad for what he's done on January 6th, but not everybody's bad on January 6th, which is true, right? You know, there were a ton of people who got gobbled up in something that they have no part and no business being in, but they did because they're part of a political prosecution and the government needed to goose their numbers up. And so this is, I think, trying to thread the needle. On the one hand, we saw Mike Pence really hit the recklessness allegation twice in there, and then by contrast come back at the end of the segment and say and explain that there isn't clarity on what Donald Trump's mindset was. But if he was reckless and he was recklessly disregarding all of the knowledge, the government is going to consider that to be knowingly, and the knowingly doesn't have to translate to the knowingly that you and I might call knowingly. It's just enough that he disregarded his advisors to meet the mens rea standard. So Mike Pence may have been very useful to Jack Smith in the prosecution, as maybe was Mark Meadows. Apparently, the Washington Post tells us that Mark Meadows was also joking about Trump's election claims. In other words, he was a close advisor who was in communication with Donald Trump, and in their communication with one another, it felt like it wasn't serious, that they were disregarding the claims and that was reckless conduct. So this might be useful in addition to Mike Pence's narrative. Washington Post tells us Mark Meadows joked about the baseless claim that large numbers of votes had been fraudulently cast by the dead. White House Chief of Staff participated in a phone call in which Trump alleged there were 5,000 dead voters in Georgia and urged Raffensperger to overturn the election. A new text message has been released, been scrutinized by federal prosecutors. Mark Meadows wrote to a White House lawyer that his son, Atlanta area attorney Blake Meadows, had been probing possible fraud and had found only a handful of possible votes cast in dead voters' names, far short of what Trump alleged. The lawyer teasingly responded that perhaps Meadows' son could locate the thousands of votes that Trump needs. The text was described by multiple people. It was a jocular exchange, not previously reported on, showing that people were openly mocking the election claims, said somebody who spoke on condition of anonymity so that they could leak this to the Washington Post. Special counsel Jack Smith is leading the investigation into Trump and his closer advisors. The text message is a small part of a broader portrait of Meadows that Smith appears to be assembling as he weighs his actions not only against Trump, but also advisors like Meadows. People close to Meadows have said that he was privately sympathetic to Trump, but Meadows played both sides, they said, often appearing to indulge Trump's desires, according to people familiar with the conversation. Trump is now named the target of a grand jury investigation. A spokesman for Smith is declining to comment. We're asking ourselves, who is going to be a part of this indictment? We'll see who the key witnesses are, what the main charges are, what the different allegations are, as we continue to cover. And so make sure wherever it is you're watching this, you are subscribed and following as we continue to cover.